everybody. Welcome to another episode of Civil Rhetoric. I am your host, Larry, also known as Chosen. Today, we have another visit from a good friend of ours of the show, Joey D. King, the VTuber. I know that's a bit of a dicier word, even since the last time we had our previous episode, which was going to be going over the topic of identity. Today, we're going to discuss something a little bit more
Hi, hi.
hearty, a little bit more robust, going into the delving into what freedom is and what it can mean for a person, but we're going to revisit a little bit about going into what
Hello,
identity
hello.
is and how at least the two of us kind of describe it and identify with it. Joey, go ahead and introduce everybody to yourself once again. It's always great having you on the show.
Thanks for having me. My name is Joey D. King. I am a virtual streamer on Twitch, on YouTube, on Kick as well, and I've been streaming for almost a year now. I've done several podcasts with my good friend Larry on several topics. It's been very insightful. This is going to be our fourth one, but for previous ones, we've discussed masculinity and femininity. We've discussed identity. We've discussed power. And all these are very interesting. But for this one, we will be discussing freedom, which is a topic I am very passionate about.
Likewise, it's kind of hard. It's funny because considering the
Hello,
previous
hello?
topics Joey, can you still hear me?
Yep. Okay, it's coming
Okay,
through.
perfect. All right. Considering the previous topics we have discovered, freedom kind of almost had to be the next thing that we discuss because everything else that we've discussed prior leads to either consuming, conserving, or eradicating someone or your own personal freedoms in life. So let's jump into the topic. I am really looking forward to it. But again, I would like to kind of bounce back because I didn't actually have an opportunity to record our previous episode, and we've had a couple audio issues in regards to kind of identity, how we define it, and what that means to us.
Right. So for our last podcast, I had a quick look through of my notes that I had taken during and before the podcast, and I just took the most important points that we came to a consensus to. But this is what I was able to jot down. So we defined identity, and from what I remember, you defined identity as what you present to the world, and I defined identity as the thing that we use to connect ourselves to the outside world. So there is this sort of consensus that it is about what the person chooses to identify that comes from the outside world that they choose to include into them, that it could be part of their identity and their values. And of course, identity, it could be anything. It could be hobbies. It could be things that you just like. It could be the people that you're around. It could be the things that you do. We connected it to masculinity in terms of the ever-present fantasy that people have of trying to save other people in order to be praised by society, right? So a fairly common fantasy would be, saving someone from a burning building, saving someone from getting attacked, from getting robbed, things like that. Ways that people can, and this is just so we can connect it back to our first podcast on masculinity and femininity, that this crisis of masculinity is a situation where people try to deal with it perhaps through fantasies where they can fantasize being masculine and that masculinity, of course, being societally accepted. Of course, this is a big issue if masculinity is a big part of one's identity, which for many people it is. So that's not an uncommon fantasy for someone to have masculinity be a big part of their identity and to try to fantasize about, being societally accepted in that way. I believe you also brought up the point that it takes a lot of strength to be yourself at all times, because when a person has multiple identities, especially conflicting identities, they might find themselves sort of switching identities. And we discussed a little bit about identity switching. So it is difficult to be yourself all the time, especially when the people around you change, the situation around you change, overall popular opinion changes, things like that. So we talked a bit about identity switching. And identity switching and being true to yourself tied into using invented non-English nouns near the end of our podcast. So since I brought up the topic, I'm now allowed to use these words. So words like normie, Chad, even a word like VTuber. These are words that don't actually exist as English standard definition nouns. And we discussed a bit about how the use of them can sort of cloud one's judgment and can be a bit morally dangerous, as calling someone these words, one, they don't have definitions, standard definitions. So you could call them this word and it could mean anything. It could be something good. It could mean something bad. The person using the word might not even know. The person you're calling or group of people you're calling these words might not even know what they mean. So we discussed a bit about how people can identify with these made up nouns, right? Like, especially the word VTuber. People can call themselves, oh, I'm a VTuber, or YouTuber. People can say, oh, I'm a YouTuber. These aren't actual English words, right? So, I would use words like YouTube content creator, something like that, a much more long form, same version of that word, but it's much more clear. Each of those words I used are actual English words, with YouTuber, or with YouTube being the proper noun. So YouTube content creator would be the long form. So that's, from my understanding, the main topping points of our identity on freedom. But if there's anything I missed, any burning comments, I would love to add on to that.
No, I think that kind of encapsulates everything that we discussed kind of in a nutshell, especially being that having that identity and being able to kind of remain on task and on code, for one of a better term, throughout an entire process. One thing that I actually encountered, I want to say this was about 2 weekends ago. I went to a screening for a documentary, The ABCs of Book Banning. And this was a documentary that leans heavily left and very liberal in terms of thought and the type of crowd that it would attract.
Right.
For myself, I still went in dressed the way I am now, which kind of looks like what most people imagine a guy on an oil rig or something, or on a farm somewhere dresses like,
Mm-hmm.
and American hat and full establishment. And I noticed that there was a bit of, like slight looks and things like that. People looking at me like, okay, what's he pretending to be? What's he not? Is he going to cause a disruption at this? And it's like, no, I'm just here to support people, voicing their First Amendment rights. And that's really what I was there for. I don't think any book should be banned, regardless of how, hot of a topic it is. Even the guy in Germany who had that special mustache, I don't think his book should be banned either. I think that it should be something we can all talk about. And in turn, me having that openness and that approach to how I feel people should kind of live and let live, it does, kind of get labeled, and it does force you to either really hold on tight and, kind of scream that identity out and say, this is who I am, this is how I feel, or it'll cause you to just kind of sit back and observe, which is what I chose to do. Because I noticed that there was a moment for other people that I did not want to trample on, even, though I did have questions that could be, invoking and
Right.
whatnot.
It could be
I
concluded as like combative, or it could be concluded as being sort of like abrasive. But I've definitely been in those situations. Yes.
Correct. And honestly, I don't think it would have had much as to what I said versus how I appeared. If I went in, wearing, more of a neutral outfit, so to speak, I think I'd be able to ask those same questions and not get immediate backlash. But because of how I presented, there was an idea of who I was kind of implanted on me. And that implanted idea, kind of became the identity that I had to accept in that place, moment in time, despite it not being, true or factual.
Right. Of course. So I completely understand that situation. And it brings up one interesting point that, of course, I would like to touch on. We might need to put a pin on this one, but that would be the idea of censorship. And censorship is a big part of freedom. Should books be censored? What should be censored? Should censorship exist at all? Things like that. So I would like to preface this by saying that I love freedom. I'm a big proponent. I love freedom. That is a big point, because if I don't bring this up, it will make the rest of what I sound not make any sense. So I personally, like I said, I love freedom, but I love freedom the way I would love my child, right? Like, I don't let it go around doing whatever it wants. I look after it. I try to raise it, and I don't go out, like, except for extreme circumstances, I don't go out and try to raise other people's children, right? So in terms of how that metaphor like makes sense, essentially, I love my freedom so much that I am willing to not let my freedom go out and do whatever it wants. My freedom has very specific guidelines that I impose on myself. We touched upon this actually not very briefly, but a bit in the podcast on identity, on how I choose not to use made up nouns that don't exist in the English dictionary, because it affects my morality and it affects my clarity of what I'm trying to say. That's an example of me loving my freedom so much I am willing to put moral restrictions on it. But these are personal moral restrictions. These aren't things I impose on other people. So same kind of thing, how I wouldn't raise someone else's kid, because, I love my freedom, and I'm sure other people love their freedom. fact, there's very few people I can imagine that don't love their freedom. But because of that, I'm not going to impose my moral restrictions I have on my freedom on other people's freedom. So that's how I love my freedom. That's how I love freedom, and that's how I think ideally it should be. But of course, that's just my opinion of the idealistic way that freedom should be loved, freedom should be appreciated. But of course, this kind of conflicts with things like censorship, things like convenience, right? So, how would you say you interpret freedom?
Well, for me, freedom is kind of like a child as well, but it's not a child that I raise solely. It's a
Right.
child that the community needs to raise and has to
Hmm.
take part in raising, based on my opinion. Simply being is freedoms that we feel, regardless of the moral right or ambiguity, can make other people feel like their freedoms are being trampled on. I actually really like the way that you only use words that are actually verifiable and words that are understood from everyone versus using some kind of accepted or, societally, not a societally accepted, but like a subgroup accepted definition for something. More along the lines you like to look at something that is more universally accepted, and that's kind of how I apply freedom. One example of this would be like a First Amendment auditor. A First Amendment auditor can go into a public area that is not traditionally like a park. They might go into a post office, or they might go into the DMV, and they'll stand there and they'll record. Other people will feel that their right to privacy is being trampled on despite them being in a public area, and that you can't trespass a camera, like you can't trespass the eyes, as long as that person isn't committing any crimes. And at that point, you kind of have a two rams butting heads over, whose freedom is more important. Is it the lawful freedom, or is it the freedom of how someone feels? And for me, I like to stick to the lawful freedom that's accepted by the society and something that we agree on as a group, because freedoms can be stretched and interpretations can definitely be stretched, which is why I think that we're made up the way we are in the United States, with having separate states able to have their own set of laws and rules, but them all being under the federal guidelines, which would be the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
I see. So that's very reminiscent of, well, I learned this in school, but we did a study of, let me see, Socrates, and Socrates had this idea that if you didn't like the rules imposed upon you by society, you should go to another society that has rules that fit personally you better, right? Um, and that was a very interesting idea back in that time, because, well, there's still a lot of land, there's still a lot of things that could be done very early on in human civilization. And so the freedom of what laws abide us, right? Because we all know laws are subject to change. These changes happen throughout time, mainly through things like convenience, things like technological improvement, and of course, things like popular opinion. So that is a good consensus to, or rather, a good rule of thumb. But for me, I look at it from, again, an idealistic perspective, right? Like, I would say the perfect way people can express freedom would be if they look at what they're free to do and only do that, and only do the things that are in their moral guidelines. Of course, these moral guidelines should be sound, right? So, personally, for me, I feel like the restrictions I put on my freedom are a lot more stringent than what the law allows me to do. Like, the law probably allows me to do many, many things that I do not allow myself to do, right? Like being intentionally mean. It isn't illegal to be like intentionally mean, but that's not something I allow myself to do, right? So, in my opinion, the freedoms that the law allows us to are a lot more lax than what I think people should allow themselves to do on well, a moral basis of their freedoms. But of course, I believe it was Voltaire that
Hello,
said,
just
like,
lurking today.
I might not like what you do, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, right? And say it is interesting because that is a specific type of freedom, being freedom of speech, right?
Yes, very
And,
much so. And freedom. Oh, sorry to cut you off. Keep
yeah.
going.
No. I was going to go off on a whole different tangent, but I feel like you had something to add on to that might be more topical to what we're talking about right now.
Well, when I look at freedom, by the way, awesome job referencing Voltaire because I was like, oh man, this is where I'm going. And then you said it. It was kind of like the Eminem and 8 Mile, where he basically insulted, not insulted, but he basically went in on himself before he gave his opponent the opportunity to. I was like, God damn, you took that from me. But I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I do disagree in terms of like the morality of things because I understand that moral codes are subjective to how someone is raised as well as the circumstances that surround them, but I do think that I think it is societally good and personally good to have a strong moral compass. I'm not the most religious person, as we've mentioned in the past. However, I will not agree. I will not disagree that the religious texts do have good guides to strong moral, righteous ways of conducting yourself or oneself rather.
Hi, Mac. How
And
you
for
doing?
me, I think something as free as the freedom of speech does and needs to be defended, but at the same time, it does not mean that it's a freedom from consequence. So if someone feels, or not even feels, if someone understands their right to say something that could be seen as inflammatory as long as it doesn't incite violence, and another person decides to, react in the way that they react, I think that that is the essence of what freedom is. I think freedom is terrifyingly scary, and it doesn't have that same cushy cuddled feel that we're kind of given from our government here in the United States. But freedom is scary, and defending it and standing up for it is even scarier.
Yes, that's actually another interesting point. I'm just going to type this down to make sure we, get back to this or go into it immediately if this is the most appropriate, follow up subject. But that would be freedom versus safety, which I think is a really big issue, because what makes freedom so scary is the fact that people can use their freedom for good, they could use it for bad, they could use it to help other people, they could use it to harm other people. And of course, in a society that has a lot of freedom, there is a lot more potential for harm, because people are free to do so, right? So how, like, I'd like to talk about how freedom relates to safety in that sort of relationship. And of course, I would say that the more free a society is, there is a higher potential for, disaster, for danger, for overall less safe, because, a less free society would be, a lot more safe, but it would be sort of like have you ever played XCOM or familiar with the XCOM games?
Familiar with the games, never played it, although.
Right. In XCOM, it's the scenario where humanity gets attacked by alien invaders, and they turn all of humanity, all of Earth, into a sort of human zoo, right? And because of the oppressive hand of the aliens, there's no war, right? There's like almost no disease. There's nothing like that because of, technological advancements thanks to the aliens. But of course, the humans have no freedom, right? They don't have the right to breed with who they want. They don't have the right to leave planet. They don't have the right to be the helm of their own destiny,
It's chatting
because the
time.
aliens' oppressive hand is so tight gripped on all of humanity. So that's a sort of extreme example of the society where there is little to no freedom, but it's very safe.
It's a That's a recurring theme in just about all of sci-fi. If you look at the fear that people have with AI and with robots, it's the robots coming to an understanding that in order to best serve and protect the humans, it's to protect them from themselves
Hey,
and
Texas Red, how
basically
you doing?
quash that freedom. It's also a recurring theme that you'll notice in like many different manga and anime. As a matter of fact, I hate to spoil it for anybody if they haven't finished Naruto, but Naruto basically kind of ends on that same vein to where you have the overarching villain who wants to provide peace. And the way to provide peace, it's not to, allow people to be free and think what they want. It's to put them in an infinite dream in which they get everything that they've ever wanted inside their own individual dream versus actually existing with everyone else in reality. And I do think that that overarching theme does kind of play on the psyche of humanity. At least for myself, it does. I've always seen it as, is control the only way to provide, actual safety, or is freedom worth the risk, versus the potential reward? And that's something I kind of struggle with all the time, even to this day.
Right. That's definitely an issue that I've also struggled with contemplating between freedom versus safety, whether, there's some sort of like middle ground, whether there's like one absolute good and we should be striving for it, like should we be striving for absolute safety, absolute freedom. Um it's definitely something that has changed my view of the world multiple times in the past. Like to bring up a personal example, I was at one point very Christian, and I've people would say I've lost my faith, but um currently I would be what's considered agnostic, right? So back when I was Christian, I had a hard time contemplating between, like, does free will exist? Because there is God, there's the Christian God, and then they know everything, right? They know what's going to happen, they know everything you've done, and they know everything that's going to be in the future. So I've contemplated, well, how can there be free will if there is this level of determinism, right? Where everything's destined to be how it is and things like that. And, I've tried to justify it multiple different ways. I'd be like, okay, well, maybe, free will exists and God just knows everything that you can possibly do, right? Every possible scenario. And in that way, God could know everything and also free will can exist. I could justify having both some level of determinism and also some level of free will and things like that. But I guess the talking point I would like to ask to you is, do you think free will exists?
Uh, I would say yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, from the perspective of being, just a creature that's carbon based that only gets to live, X amount of years, I would say that my understanding of a higher plane or a higher being that's capable of, let's say it was even just math, and that creature was able to, compute everything that I did and basically could determine a series of set, paths for my life. And I get to choose those paths, kind of like a pick your own, pick your own adventure or pick your own scare book.
Right.
The only thing is, with the book itself already being written and the paths already being provided, is it the free will to do it, or is it just I'm given a set, you know, amount of options, and my free will only exists in the ability to choose which option that I go through or move forward with?
Right. And, for all we know, every option could be the same, right? Because, you can't really look to the future and be, oh, well, this path would have been different anyway. But, so the way I see it now that I've, become agnostic, is I think free will exists, but I think it exists as an abstract object. That's something I believe we touched on the last podcast when we discussed, Platonism versus nominalism, that being the main difference being abstract objects versus non-abstract objects, being, well, are there objects that exist that don't take a physical form that have some effect on the universe? So this would be things like math, things like love, things like gravity, right? So, whether or not you think all of these are abstract objects or not, abstract Platonism argues that there are abstract objects, we just haven't observed them yet, right? So, I guess, for example, I guess gravity, right? Like gravity has an effect on the universe, but you can't get like a cup of gravity, right? Or, maybe something like math. People could argue math has a big effect on the universe, regardless of people being there to observe it. But you can't get a cup of math, right? Math doesn't have a physical form. So I believe, just to reiterate, I believe free will exists as an abstract object, and it probably has an effect on our universe, assuming that everything isn't just deterministic and it's not just molecules that determine everything. But if free will does exist, for the sake of the argument, I would say it exists as an abstract object.
Well, I would definitely agree because, like you mentioned, it's not something that you can have a cup of or something you can, verifiably measure. It's just kind of like the example that the Supreme Court justice used when, defining pornography versus versus art. And he said, I don't know what the difference between art and pornography is, but I know porn when I see it. And that's kind of where I'm at with that regard. I know what it feels like to feel the illusion or the reality of freedom. I'm just not 100% if I can understand what a world would be even with the absence of it, within the absence of that freedom mean that freedom does exist, because to not have it means that it has to exist.
Hmm.
I don't know. It's one of those head turners and head scratchers for me.
I see. I never thought of it like that. I always considered freedom as always kind of existing, but now you've brought the idea that, free will might not exist. Free will might exist in the future. Free will might have existed in the past and we don't have it now anymore. There's definitely things I've never considered, but if I was to go down those avenues, I'd probably spend hours and hours just contemplating, well, if freedom existed in the past, when did it end? Was I alive when it ended? Maybe free will existed as soon as I was born, right? And I'm like the only person with free will. I've that whole right, it's all a simulation theory, and then that goes into existentialism. It's definitely something worth talking about, but maybe a bit too abstract in terms of how it relates to freedom, because I believe for the sake of this podcast, we have to assume freedom exists. Because if it doesn't exist, we could just there would be no point in talking about it, right?
I agree. And I do in my heart, I do believe that freedom does exist. It's just that that abstract thought is kind of always there and ever present,
Of
which is
course.
why I think that if there were such a thing as previous lives, I was like some kind of Russian, liter like guy who wrote Russian literature. I was
Right.
like, man, I like the amount of time I've spent going down these rabbit holes. I mean, just in my own head, when I'm meditating, or if I'm in the sauna, or if I'm in the plunge, and you have that moment of clarity, and it's like, oh God, this is gonna be hours, hours, hours past my bedtimes.
Oh yeah, it definitely. Honestly, I've okay. Just to go off a bit on a tangent, on a personal tangent, I've been sort of dedicating specific times in the day to ruminate about the wonders of the universe and all that stuff, so it doesn't keep me up at night anymore. So sometimes when there's lulls in the workday, right, I'm just standing there, nothing to do. Right, just burning daylight rather than just wasting oxygen. I'm like, okay, now is the time to start ruminating on the wonders of the universe. So I don't sit there thinking about it when I'm trying to go to bed, right? But yeah, that's just a bit of, and because of freedom, that's a wonderful thing I'm allowed to do with freedom. I'm free to think. Thinking is free. That's great. But yeah, I allocate that during, lulls in the workday, sometimes during lunchtime, things like that. Definitely helps the day go by a lot faster, I'd say.
Oh, definitely makes life a lot more entertaining as well.
Oh yeah, honestly, I'll be okay. I don't want to go off too often on a tangent. We got to save some time for talking about the important stuff. But you would catch me pacing around, leaving a dent on the floor of my workstation because I'm pacing around thinking about this stuff. And then people look at me and they're like, "What is he doing? Why is he pacing around?"
The amount of times I've had that happen to me, or even with my wife, she's like, "What are you thinking about?" I'm like, "Oh, what are you talking about?" She's like, "I can tell you're thinking about something."
Yeah, you're making a groove in the floor with all the pacing you're doing.
Yeah, and the thing that I do, especially when my mind just kind of trails off, it's if I'm having a beer or any kind of drink that has a label on it, I
Hmm.
tend to pick the label, flatten the label back out, pick the label, flatten the label back out. I'll find something that's physically stimulating or reassuring, while I'm kind of going down that rabbit hole, using that as a bit of an anchor to get back, so to speak.
Right. So, okay, so let's touch back upon societally accepted uses of freedom, right? These are basically what the law allows us to be free in terms of, well, mostly for our own good, right? For example, it's illegal to yell it's that there's a fire in a crowded theater, right? Regardless of if there's a fire or not, because well, the likely consequences of doing that are very, very tragic: loss of human life, trampling, things like that. So that would be an example of societally accepted limitations to free speech, because for the most part free speech is limitless, at least here in the Western world and some other parts of the world as well. Not all parts of the world have the luxury of free speech, but in the areas that
Yeah.
do, of course, right, it's for the most part almost limitless. You can say almost whatever stupid thing you want, almost. Limitations, of course, being one of which I just mentioned, not being able to yell fire in a crowded theater. And of course, you have other things like, libel and things like that. Right? Of course, these are for our own good, for our own benefit. But the way I see this, and I see this relationship a lot in terms of technology and convenience, is that the way I see it over time, right? If someone was to possibly map out the amount of freedom we have from say, a couple hundred years ago to now, I would say we have a lot more free will, freedom to do things, the liberty to do things. So I'm going to use the word freedom and liberty interchangeably. I don't make a distinction here. Uh, I would say we have a lot more freedom to do things now than we had several hundred years ago, and that's mainly because of the convenience of technology. Technology allows us to have a lot more things and be able to say a lot more things that we wouldn't be able to before. This could just be exchange of ideas and things like that. But I think that's partly it, but also partly the convenience of it. Like there might be a point in the future where a person can yell fire in a crowded theater and it wouldn't be illegal because nothing would happen, right? There might be a point where technology is just so good that we don't have to worry about things like trampling, right? Like we don't have to worry about things like giant birds coming down and plucking a human off and eating them, right? Because well, they've all gone extinct, right? They've all gone extinct because humanity's really good at making weapons and hunting things to extinction too, right? So
Agreed.
there might be some cyberpunk esque time in the future. Well, doing that will actually cause nothing to happen, and when we get to that point, that people would have that freedom. Not that they would ever really use it, but the fact that it exists proves that as technology progresses, people get more and more freedom because things are more convenient, people are a lot safer, things like that.
You see, I don't have as much hope for the human race in regards to acquiring more freedom, and I'm not sure I can 100% agree. Although I agree with, like, I want to agree with everything that you just said. It's just
Mm-hmm.
when I look at the world and I look at the amount of advertisements and indoctrination that kind of goes on within society today, I don't know if I can say we have more freedom now than we had prior, because you have, becoming a social pariah, you
Mm-hmm.
have social suicide, social death. And on top of that, we're kind of held in this checks and balancing system of, well, do you agree with the crowd? And is the crowd going to support you? Because if not, you're going to be canceled. And then if you disagree with anyone in the subgroup that you're canceled to, you get canceled from that subgroup, and so on and so forth. And like those repercussions, from what I've noticed and I've observed even to myself, case in point, the screening that I went to,
Mm-hmm.
those things, I think that they're restricting and restrictive of freedom. Although we do have the opportunity and option for it, I think a lot of times, like, we as a people, as we get lazy, and instead of taking the responsibility that comes with that freedom, we kind of just push it off on others and hope that the government kind of takes care of it for us.
I see. So, yeah, I guess I can probably rethink that. So, with that into account, the fact that, as a society, because things like getting canceled are things that are afforded to us because of technology and because of convenience. Like, before social media, this wasn't really a thing, right? You had, like, I guess, I don't know, public humiliation where you would, like, put someone in a stock and just, berate them or whatever. But now we can do that. Right.
Scarlet letters for women who were unchaste or
Now,
chaste.
right now we can do that through the internet, through an online form of societal self-censorship. I would say I would rephrase what I'm saying now to say technology as time progresses affords us the potential to be more free. Whether or not society actually follows that potential really depends, right? Like for all we know, in the next 10, 100 years, people could become a lot nicer and a lot more moral. I'm not betting my money on that, but right? I'm not betting my money on that, but the potential is there. The potential to be more free exists over time as we get more technology, as things become more convenient. But whether or not public humiliation ever stops being a thing, public censorship, canceling, whether or not that eventually ever stops or it just progresses into, an even more technologically advanced form, I can't predict the future. I can't say. But, according to the relationship I've seen, it seems like public humiliations, public censorships are always going to exist because they have for a while.
Yeah, that's something I do think is always going to exist. And, the proliferation of technology is just going to make it more efficient. Before, you can kind of run away from it. You can go to another town and say your name is John. But now it's like, no, you're not John. You're so and so. You live in so and so. And here's what you did in elementary and high school and junior high.
Goodness.
And yeah, it follows you now. But I mean, as humans, I do believe it's up to the individual to kind of kind of break that curse and then, accept the responsibility again that comes with said freedom.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's really convenient to sit down and veg out in front of a TV and, not do something that can help make yourself, be placed in a better position in life.
Yeah. I mean, oh, if I was to imagine a nightmarish scenario where technology advances and this sort of canceling self-censorship, public humiliation was to get worse. So are you familiar with the Neuralink that Elon Musk is developing?
Yes.
Would I, okay, so, if you're, before the spread of social media, if you were just John, right, and you just, something happened in your town and everyone knows you as the John that did that, the John that did this or whatever, you just left town, go to a new town, and suddenly you're a new John, right? Now with social media, you could go to another town, but if that town has social media, you'll still be that John that did this or did that or said this and said that. In a nightmare scenario, if I was to imagine, if I was to propose what would happen in the future if technology was to get better and we still did self-censorship and still did public humiliation, I imagine you probably can't even escape through your thoughts because Neuralink would put the public humiliation right in your brain. And then, what do? You can't turn off the computer. You can't go in and be a hermit. You got the Neuralink right in your brain. You're gonna have to go off wire. But that's just me proposing crazy thoughts that enter my mind as we're having these discussions. It's very stimulating, these kinds of conversations, I'd say.
I would agree. And it's something that's like ever present, but we as people, we don't typically get to exchange ideas about it with other people because it seems to be something that's so simple, but the intricacy of the simplicity is what makes it so like thought provoking, so to speak, because it really can tie into everything that we do, down to the clothes that we decide to wear and the groups that we affiliate with and the affinities we have for different things.
Of course, right? Personally speaking, I could probably relate freedom back to everything we've previously discussed: identity, power, masculinity. It's all connected. So, that is something that could take hours and hours and hours, just perfectly dissecting it down to what it really is, down to what it means, the relationships it has with every other idea. We can touch upon it briefly as it pops up. So let's see here. Let's talk a bit about what did I write in my notes? Because I took a lot of notes before this podcast.
Likewise. The cool thing, and this is a plug, I'm not getting paid by Zencaster, but you can actually set it up to where you have a teleprompter. So thankfully now I actually have all my notes on the right hand side on my second screen.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Rock.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's actually been super helpful because I went from writing down all my notes from our previous conversations,
Mhm.
where it's there, it's in front of me, and for the most part I can still maintain eye contact with the camcorder or with the webcam, versus, man, I'm old. I said camcorder, but basically maintaining contact with the webcam, versus doing the quick dart over, and it's a really good reference point. So I'm not getting paid by them, but something to think about to anyone out there that's listening.
Sounds like a really good idea. I probably might get myself one of those. Okay, so this is something that my friend the General, I bring him up sometimes. Me and him, we talk a lot about this kind of stuff, mainly offline. Just a lot of, I guess you'd call them ruminations. But he put me onto this idea of positive and negative freedom. Are you familiar with positive and negative freedom?
I'm familiar with the terminology, but I don't have a direct, concrete definition for it. No.
Yes. So when he put me onto this, because I have never heard of this, I'm like, positive and negative freedom. I never even heard of that. So I looked into it, and it's something that's very, very interesting that I would like to talk about. So negative freedom, if I was to put it in a sort of heuristic, a rule of thumb, negative freedom is essentially the idea of being free from things. So this is, being free from censorship, being free from tyranny, being free from, I guess, reprisal, right? Being free from things, that's negative freedom. So if a person has negative freedom, believes in negative freedom, they would say that they are free from things that would keep them from being free. Again, tyranny, censorship, reprisal, things like that. Positive freedom is the idea of you're free to. right? So positive freedom is saying, oh, I am free to go out and get milk. I am free to go out and choose my partner. I am free to, sit in front of a camera, sit in front of a microphone and have a podcast. These are all things that we have the opportunity, the chance to do because of what society affords us. So that is the main difference between positive and negative freedom. And proponents of either one tend to kind of clash. Personally speaking, after reading about it, I believe it is possible to have both positive and negative freedom. But from what I've defined it as, I would like to know your thoughts on positive and negative freedom.
Oddly enough, it ties in, and we've done this a lot in previous episodes where we tie things into stoicism, and I think the idea of negative and positive freedom kind of existing, I guess, in symmetry with each other versus in opposition to each other
Mm-hmm.
is something that I think that most people kind of associate with. Like I myself do believe in negative freedom because I do believe that you can do just about anything at least once, and you
Mm-hmm.
do have the freedom to do that. Although that doesn't mean that you're free from the repercussions of what you do,
Right.
being someone else reacting towards your actions of freedom. But we do have that freedom, that God-given right, for want of a better term. And in terms of positive freedom, I do think that that's more along the lines of like the legal or the legal freedoms that we have, because yeah, we're free to go to the store unless there's a worldwide pandemic, and in which
Of
case you
course.
can only you can only go whenever they say you can. So that is also kind of tying into like, do we really have said freedom if it can be revoked? And if it can be revoked, does that mean that we operate in a society on positive freedoms versus the negative freedoms, which are more than likely what the criminal element, I guess, would associate with, or the proposed criminal element, because they're doing things even when they're told they can't go to a party or have a party, they're still having that damn party because that's their God given right, so to speak.
Right. So I looked at it from the like well, maybe this is just a thing I do. I like looking at it from the extremes, right? Like so for me, the first thing I did was I looked at it and like, okay, what's a scenario where a person has limitless negative freedom but has no positive freedom? And I would think, okay, this man is in a void, right? There's no society, there's no like they're basically not given anything. In which case they have almost limitless, or actually that's as limitless as you get in terms of negative freedom. Nothing, literally nothing is stopping them. No other person, no other thing, no other phenomenon. Right? A man in a void would have limitless negative freedom. And if I was to take away all their positive freedom, well, they would basically be dead. But if I was to afford them some positive freedom with this limitless negative freedom, that would be the man in the void. In that they're really only free to do what they physiologically can do with their body, right? In this void. Again, limitless negative freedom. There's nothing stopping them. No person, thing, or phenomenon other than themselves. And the only positive freedom they have would be what they can physiologically do. That is how I see it in terms of the extreme. Right. And if I was to come up with an example of someone who has limitless positive freedom but like no negative freedom, that I'd imagine it would be something like, so you have this man, and I guess it's kind of like in the example when you brought up with Naruto, where in their mind they are in this paradise where they can have anything they want, but really they're kind of in reality just in this sort of comatose. They they have no actual way to guide their own future because they're stuck in their body. In this example in Naruto, where they can't actually do anything. So that would be the two extremes as I see them. So after looking at the two extremes, I could kind of see what their relationship is to each other. And of course, we live in a world where we're kind of in the middle of this spectrum, where we have negative and we have positive freedom. So yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
agreed.
right.
Yeah,
So
there's one family, oddly enough. This was in the 1700s in Russia, where Catholicism had kind of taken foot and taken hold. And I meant to write this down in my notes, but I did not. Yeah, I did not. This family basically thought that the people that were in society and in the towns were kind of separating too far or straying too far from the true word of God and and the Catholic God. So what they decided to do was this man and his wife and his family went to go live in the woods, and they just lived in the woods. And then one day, like I want to say a generation or two later, some people were out hiking. This was in the 1800s. My apologies.
Hmm.
Late 1800s until the early 1900s, and a person was hiking through the woods and came across this gangly, young lady and her sisters, and then they realized that, ultimately that was the family that went to go live in the woods. They didn't die; they just lived in the woods. And when they met the guy who originally decided to depart with his wife, he had mentioned that the hardest thing in the world to deal with out of society was not having salt, and that was like basically it was akin to being cast into hell. Outside of that, he was completely happy with his life living in the woods, and then they set up some trade, and then eventually his children assimilated back into the society and the culture. But that was a person who lived in an aspect of having that positive, but chose the route of negative freedom, and just the amount of just additional work that came with that, even just to survive.
Right. So that's definitely an example of, you know, positive and negative freedom clashing, choosing to give up your positive freedom, the things society affords you to have in exchange for, much, much more, or, depending on how free they were to begin with, more negative freedom. And I could see the reasoning why they chose that, of course. From a conventional standpoint, people can look at them and say, what? They're crazy. Like, why would they just go off into the woods, right? And throw away everything that society affords them, like salt, right? Like, having plumbing, working toilets, things like that, electricity, of course. Um, but yeah, so I could see why people say that positive and negative freedom can clash. But the way I see it overall, things are getting better, or at least potentially could get better in terms of positive and negative freedom. Over time, we are allotted a lot more positive freedoms, right? Like in many ways, we're living much better than kings, and of course, in many ways,
Oh
we're
yeah.
living much worse than kings, of course. But um, all the things that society affords us, they're great, and we're going to get many, many more as time goes on, potentially. Assuming that there's not some sort of world-ending disaster or anything like that. But barring that, things are just going to get better as technology gets better. And in terms of negative freedom, because the way I see it, positive freedom can go almost limitless, right? There's almost no limit, the way I see it, to how far society can afford us the ability to do things, right? Thanks to technology. But in terms of negative freedom, I don't think there's limitless negative freedom. I think that at a certain point, a person can be completely devoid of anything in their way of their freedom, because negative freedom is, of course, the freedom from things, freedom from tyranny, freedom from whatever is keeping them from reaching their potential, from reaching the potential of their liberty. So I think, yeah, I think the main difference, or one of the differences between positive and negative freedom, just to reiterate, is that positive freedom, I think, can potentially go limitless, whereas negative freedom, I think there is a limit. Eventually, a person would have all the negative freedom that they could possibly ever want.
Agreed. I mean, just like that family decided to go live in the woods, they were still beholden to what they could physically accomplish on their own and what they can get done. And so that would be the limit of their negative freedom. While positive freedom is something that, it does seem to not really have a ceiling. That's something that seems to only really just grow with the opportunities that, especially through technology, that are presented to us. Yeah, negative freedom just kind of does have a basement. It does have a baseline. It has like a floor that it can reach,
Right.
versus
What?
positive freedom having that ceiling that's limitless.
Right. Exactly. Like once you have essentially devoid yourself of pretty much other people, there's nothing really in your way of your negative freedom. So you've reached the cap of your negative freedom. But let's just not get it twisted. I don't think positive freedom is more important than negative freedom, or vice versa. I think that they're both important in different ways. Even though positive freedom can be limitless, from what I've observed, like from the relationship of how positive freedom just keeps increasing and there's more and more positive freedom, I don't think that makes it more important than negative freedom, and of course other way
Agreed.
around. I think, if we were to talk about, inalienable rights, right, like free speech and things like that, these would be inalienable rights. So both positive and negative freedom are both important, but they're important for different ways. Negative freedom, I think people should have some negative freedoms that should be protected regardless, right? Ideally regardless, right? And positive freedoms are, of course, important because that is what humanity strives for. That's, why we, keep pushing the bounds of technological limitations. That's why, humanity has made itself a much more convenient race to be in. Of course, in the animal kingdom, of course, because, well, technology, because, humanity with its technology has dominated the planet. And, the better we are at, using our energy, making technology, the more of, I guess, observers of the universe we can be, right? Like, as of now, we can really just observe Earth. We can observe, faraway stars. But eventually, barring some sort of world-ending disaster or some sort of, like, human race-wiping virus or whatever, barring those things, humanity might eventually be the observers of the whole universe eventually, right?
Yeah, kind of like the Watchers in Marvel. Like that's something that we may be able to ascend to at some point in time, and it might be something we ascend to now after death. I mean, who knows, you know?
Right. But all that would be wouldn't like all that would be worthless if not for negative freedom. Like if we didn't have the freedom to be observers of the universe, why go out and spread humanity and try to be observers of the universe if not for that negative freedom?
Agreed. And I think it's not really a clash of what's kind of going on nowadays. It's a part of, like this rapid evolution of technology and, us trying to basically change our genetics in a way because these are all things that were not available to, you know, even like our predecessors, like my parents couldn't get on the internet and access everything early in their life, even when they were in like their 30s. That
Mm-hmm.
wasn't available to them. And now as we progress and like we're having all these leaps in technology, it's getting our physiology as well as just our mental capacity to a point place in time to where we can actually take advantage of and exercise those freedoms, both the positive and the negative aspects. And when I say negative, it's yes, you now have the ability to talk to a kid in Russia, versus writing them a snail mail letter and being
Mm-hmm.
pen pals and getting 6 letters a year, if that. So it does open the world up a lot more to that, and I think that that's an increase in both negative and positive freedoms. It's basically lowering the basement a little bit further for the negative freedoms and just allowing positive freedoms, like we mentioned before, to just kind of go where the stars take them.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting relationship between positive and negative freedom. And like as I'm talking about it, like I'm going off notes for some of this stuff because as we're discussing it, I'm like realizing things I never realized. Which like again, I was working on these notes for like the past week, so this is all new stuff that's coming to me like in minutes between having a back and forth as opposed to just ruminating on myself. I'm like, let me think about negative freedom. Let me think about positive freedom. So yeah, it's this kind of back and forth that really speeds up the process, I'd say. So let's see here. For this next part, I have written down here. I have a way, or rather, I found an example of a relationship that I think can tie freedom to identity, which we discussed last time. So this is going to use some terms I made up, mainly to help expedite the process. So, okay, so let's see here. Yeah, so here's an interesting relationship that I noticed. When there are two opposing identities, whether it's two people or two groups, or rather, it works better with groups. If there are two groups of opposing identities, right? I noticed one group is something I would call the empirically popular group, and the other group I would call the abstract group. And the empirically popular group is just the group that is the most popular, right? It's something that they can measure, right? It has the most members, or their members have, right, the most influence, the most money, the most resources. This empirically popular group is the group that is sort of the dominant group. The second group, again, these are with two clashing identities, and they could be anything. Identities could be anything. So it could be like waffle eaters and pancake eaters or what have you. It could be chess players and checker players. But when you have these two opposing identities that are clashing, and one is the empirically popular group, and the other I'll call the abstract group. And I call it the abstract group because the abstract group never describes itself as the empirically unpopular. They'll never say join us because we're because we have less people, or we're less powerful, or we're less dominant. They'll say things like join us because we're the underdogs, or join us because we love you more, or join us because we love freedom and they hate freedom. Now, this is where I'm going to tie identity to freedom, because I noticed a very interesting relationship between the empirically popular group and the abstract group. And of course, over time, these two groups can switch places, right? Eventually, the empirically popular group becomes the abstract, and then the abstract becomes the empirically popular, and then they'll switch back. This is something I've noticed before with, two opposing groups. They're going to switch places over time as opinions change. So one thing I noticed between the two groups is their relationship to freedom. As a heuristic, as like a general rule of thumb, I tend to notice that the abstract group tends to say that they love freedom more than the empirically popular group. I don't know why, but that just seems to be the case. Whether or not that's just, I don't see the whole story. Maybe it's just, I'm sort of discovering it as I'm explaining it. Maybe this changes over time and I could be wrong. But for the most part, these two groups, the abstract group tends to say that the empirically popular group hates freedom and they themselves love freedom. But ironically enough, when they switch places, opinions also change. And now what was once the abstract group that's now the empirically popular group, now they stop leveraging their love of freedom, and now the empirically popular group that's now the abstract says, oh, we love freedom, but they hate freedom. And personally speaking, I don't see either group loving freedom. I think the abstract group is just leveraging freedom, right? It's just more of their abstract talk. It's more, we're the underdogs, we love you, we're this, we're that. They can't say they're the empirically popular. They can't say that they have more people. They can't say that they have more of this, more of that, because it's not empirically true. So they'll say things like, we love freedom and they hate freedom. Whereas the empirically popular group, I don't think they love freedom either. I think they might see it as a nuisance. Again, this is just sort of a relationship that I've noticed. But given all that, what would you say?
Oddly enough, as you were kind of going through your example, what popped in my head was cults,
Right.
And honestly, mixing solvents. The reason why I thought about mixing solvents is basically you have the empirically powerful or the empirically popular group, and that empirically popular group would basically be, let's say you're mixing orange oil into alcohol and it's 95% soluble. That 5% that settles at the bottom has to be strained out. And then someone who is, a part of that opposing group is saying, well, we don't like to have that 5% waste. We think that 5% waste should be used in another way. And then when given the opportunity to be the ones controlling the solution, they still end up with said waste. And instead of focusing on the 5% as they did before, then they'll talk about how 95% of that, is not waste and it's good for you and it's safe. And I think it's just a matter of trying to win. And when you're a part of the subgroup that not is the group in power, you will pick all of the things that are basically issues of power, because
Right.
having power and having a group means that there needs to be some things that are excluded, which is what kind of forms the cohesiveness of the group. And the excluded feel like if they were in power, they wouldn't exclude anyone.
Right. Of course.
Although once they do gain power, they then begin to exclude. It's actually seen in every rom-com or teenage coming of age. The nerd is really, really hot, and all he had to do was take the glasses off, and it's kind of like that Frankenstein monster. It's something that I think that that's never going to be able to change because people want to be in lead, and when they are in lead, they want to maintain said lead. And in which case, you have people that are going to be opposing that because they think they can do it better when all of it comes with its faults.
Right. So, yeah. So you also see the relationship between when the empirically, actually, I prefer your term better, the empirically powerful group, because it isn't always just having more members that makes this group the empirically popular. It could just be resources. It could just be the loudness of their voice. Right. It could just be that they're just more vocal about it. But yeah, I like the term you use better. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start saying that from now on: empirically powerful and abstract group. I feel like that's more accurate to what I'm trying to say here anyway. But yeah, so
let's do that.
Definitely.
Because that's kind of what's going on today in society, where they create these two separate groups, this tribalism that occurs.
Hmm.
And it's basically, it's like feminism versus, let's say red pill.
Hmm.
They're both saying the same thing. It's just the guys over here are saying it about the guys, and the gals over here are saying that about the gals. It's all one and the same. And there is an answer there. It just kind of lies in the middle.
Yeah, like I would say that neither, like, anytime there's these two groups, the empirically powerful and the abstract, I would say neither of them would think, of course, that they're the bad guy, right? Like, no group says we're pro this and the other group says we're anti that, actually, right? There's no like, oh, we're pro freedom. Well, guess what? We're the anti freedom. No, they would call themselves, we are, oh wait, this is starting to sound kind of like a pro-life thing, but like, okay,
Yeah.
so like,
Uh-oh.
yeah, exactly. But like, okay, I don't want to make this particularly topical because I would like the ideas we're talking about to be seen sort of, dare I say, year round, decade round. Because who really knows, like, at the end of the day, what groups are still going to exist, still be powerful or non-powerful, abstract or non-abstract. So that's why, I tend to not pick on any specific groups, right? So I'll say things like, oh, A, B, X, Y, Mr. John, Mrs. Smith, things like that. Just so things can stay. So that way the ideas we're talking about don't get tied to any group that might not exist ever, right, in the future or whatnot. Our ideas will still be what we're saying. But anyway, outside of that little tangent I threw there, okay, so yeah, you could see the relationship between the empirically powerful and the abstract, because the abstract would never call themselves the empirically weak, right?
Not at all.
They would
never call the other group the empirically powerful
exactly, but they even though one group has to be more powerful in some sense, whether it's popularity, whether it's resources, whether again it's just the loudness of their voice, that group is the more dominant empirically, right? Like you can measure how much more dominant they are. The other group, of course, will try to raise up their value through abstract things. Like I said before, they'll call themselves the underdogs. Join us because we're the underdogs, or join us because we love you more. Join us because they hate freedom and we love freedom. Through some abstract value, they'll say, be part of our group and not their group. So you obviously see the relationship here. Now, how this ties to freedom, right? Because as I've described, this is very reminiscent of our last podcast on identity. I'm talking about two groups that have an identity and they clash, right? Now, how this relates to our topical podcast on, not topical, but on the topic of freedom, is how the groups relate to freedom, right? Of course, usually the abstract group will say we love freedom, they hate freedom, and the empirically popular group will generally see freedom as kind of a nuisance to their power. So again, I don't think either group loves freedom, because at its core they're just both using it. In my opinion, I would say to love freedom would be to have limitations that people impose on that freedom that are sound, that are moral, but still the potential to be free is there, right? The potential to have that negative freedom is there. It's just, it should be guided by morals, right?
Definitely. And I do think that the fact that the two opposing, groups can exist is a testament also to the amount of freedom that does exist.
Oh,
You know,
definitely,
it
yeah.
it does seem like humans have had this throughout history. We'll always find, something to rally behind and something else to rally against. And it seems like that's, I mean, everywhere in the world, it's always going to be that, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada. We all seem to do that. And we all like to think that the group that we choose are the good guys. And there's no way possible that we could be the quote unquote bad guys. And I do think that false dichotomy that we create is what limits us and our freedom, because it prevents us from seeing what that middle ground potentially is, or something completely different, and relatively new altogether.
Yeah, actually, now that you bring that up about how like having two dichotomous groups is a testament to freedom, I guess you're right on that. In that, if I went into a society and everyone agreed on everything, I would definitely be raising some eyebrows. Even if it's what I idealist, like if everyone in that society came to the conclusion of, oh, we're all going to be moral and we all know we have freedom, but we're all going to limit our freedom based on morals, all collectively. If everyone in that society came to that conclusion, I would be raising some eyebrows. I'm like, what kind of alien world, parallel dimension did I hop myself into? Because people don't act like this. Strange enough, because ideally that's what I would want. I would want everyone to come to that conclusion on their own. But if I came into a society like that, I would think, what's going on? Is this like a secret dictatorship? Like, is there some sort of secret police I don't know about that's like keeping people from like acting different, from like having dichotomous groups? So realistically, that's, probably what's going to happen if a society has multiple groups, whether or not they're right or they're wrong or they're way off bounds or whatever. Just the fact that they exist tells me that this society has freedom. Definitely.
Oh, agreed. And that's actually evident in a lot of sci-fi film and literature. The Don't Worry, Darling movie. I couldn't give you any of the actors. I even fell asleep on it when trying to watch it.
That's fair.
But it was basically living in a world that was, virtual reality, unbeknownst to them, and everyone, acted and did everything the way they should be, and everyone looked perfect and acted perfect. But in reality, they were all under the thumb of, said group that actually had the control. And I do think that anytime you have a homogenous society that, everyone thinks, feels, and acts the same, because we're humans and because we understand that's just not the way humans are and the way humans evolved and can actually be, we understand that there is a restriction of freedom in some shape or form, whether it's through lack of knowledge, whether it's through lack of understanding, or just, through sheer brute force. We understand that having those two groups or three groups or four groups that are in, competition with each other, it's a testament to, okay, well, this is a free society. Because if you're somewhere that doesn't allow you, to have an opposing opinion to the popular regime, that would suggest there's a lack of freedom that's available to you.
Yes, specifically negative freedom, because they would not have freedom from tyranny, freedom from reprisal, freedom from the law, keeping them from being free, from reaching the potential of their liberty. So yeah, that's very true. I never really noticed it like that, but yeah, there's sort of this weird, I don't want to call it hypocrisy, but there's this weird discourse between what I idealistically want and what I realistically expect.
Correct. That's because you understand humans and humanity and you accept the
Mhm.
fact, at least from the conversations we've had, this is something that I've come to accept myself. I am very gung ho about my opinions and I think that I am unequivocally right. But at the same time, I understand that I could be 1000% completely wrong.
Exactly.
And yeah, and I that's something I see from you when we have our conversations. And that, the essence of that, it allows us to explore, but also it allows us to understand that there are certain things that are inherent to humans and there are certain things that are not. And living that, perfect, everyone thinks and acts the same way life, that's not inherently human.
Yeah, honestly, that would be a perfect world. And, we may never be a perfect world, but at least we can always strive to be closer to a perfect world.
Agreed.
Hmm.
Agreed. And that's a lot more human.
Definitely. Let's see here. What else do I have? Hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about free speech, because free speech is a very interesting kind of liberty in that it singles out just the action of speech. And there are very interesting rules in society, for the most part, that I'm familiar with at least, regarding free speech. So, in terms of the negative liberty of our actions, most societies that are law abiding would agree not to that you're not allowed to hurt other people, right? For the most part, right? Like, it's not illegal to be mean, at least not in this country, but you cannot like physically hurt people. That's against the rules. And in most law-abiding societies, that's fairly common, not to be able to hurt other people. But in terms of freedom of speech, that's a very specific action that, again, for the most part, because laws are different everywhere, for the most part, the freedom of speech is the action that has very few it has a lot of negative freedom. There are very few things that keep people from being free of speech. Why is that? Because speech, for the most part, is fairly harmless, right? It isn't the same as like hurting someone. You could be mean to somebody, right? You could be completely biased to somebody. You can say all kinds of things, but you aren't actually, right, like physically putting yourself onto somebody. So, and also it's very difficult to sort of police free speech, like as much as, many countries, many governing bodies like to do. Controlling free speech is very difficult because, well, practically speaking, people can, be in their homes, say whatever they want. When they say it online, they could be fairly anonymous. So controlling free speech is very difficult, and it's also relatively harmless. Not completely harmless, of course. In my opinion, I think the intention to do harm with your words is bad. Well, I'm not sure if I would say it's as bad, but I would say it is bad, it is evil, and it is evil in the same way that having the intention to hurt someone through physical is the same way. Like me, I would consider myself a deontologist. So I would say that having bad intentions is bad. Whether that's the intention to say bad things or to do bad things, the intention of doing bad things is bad, regardless of whether it's a speech or an action. But I think that is why, free speech is a very particular kind of freedom that needs its own sort of section.
I would agree. Oddly enough, I think free speech is something that, at least here in the Western side of the world, we do get to actually explore that to an extent. Because again, you are free to say it, but it does not necessarily mean that you're going to be free from reprisal or free from, the resulting of what you say or what you believe or what you champion. And I do think the ability to say what you want, as long as it's not inciting violence or anything like that, I do believe that that's something that we all inherently have and that we all should participate in. And despite, cultures, from Eastern cultures to a lot of sub-Saharan cultures, places that I've been, even the people there, even the most upstanding citizens there, when they want to access something that, their country may potentially block, they just use a VPN and they gain access to it. So
Mm-hmm.
there, that freedom is still there, and it's extremely hard to police it, even if you come from like a completely totalitarian, regime, such as a place like North Korea,
Mm-hmm.
where you
Right.
have people that are able to escape, get over here, and live their life, and then experience things that they never even thought, could exist within their lifetime, let alone, their family members and whatnot. So, in short, free speech is important. Free speech should be defended, even if you don't agree with what's being said.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, I also don't think people should be free of the consequences. But the way I see it, there are consequences that are likely to happen when a person does a thing, right? Like, if you fill your house with enough dynamite, what's going to happen? House explodes. Don't be surprised when your house explodes if you keep filling it with dynamite. Exactly, right? So, use common sense and things like that. But in my opinion, I think the biggest fault someone has when they do something bad, when they do something evil, right? Like, if someone says something mean, something with ill intent, I think the biggest consequence for me is not what comes from the outside world, what people will do in terms of reprisal. So if someone says something mean and, something mean happens to them, yeah, I think, those are fairly logical consequences for things to happen. But I think the biggest consequence is the internal consequence that happens on a person. If a person has bad intentions, if they say something with bad intent or they do something with bad intent, I think the biggest consequence is what it has on their character. Because what's going to happen is either they live up to, either they own up to those bad intentions, right? They apologize, they make it right. Either that happens or that doesn't happen. If that doesn't happen, what's going to happen is they're going to go down a sort of slippery slope where they become sort of more and more evil, where they have more and more chances to show their ill intent because they think, okay, well, I had bad intentions, and nothing happened, or rather, I didn't think anything happened, or I don't even mind if something bad happened. I don't care, right? If they have that sort of nonchalantness to it, they're just going to get more and more evil because it's kind of like a slippery slope, right? They don't care, So they're just going to, be worse off as a person. I think the biggest consequence is not the reprisal they may get from the outside world, from other people. I think the biggest consequence is what being evil, having bad intentions has on that person, because they will lose the opportunity to sharpen their morals, or they own up to it, right? They bite the bullet and they say, okay, I had bad intentions, I did something wrong, I'm going to own up to it and be a better person. That's is what I think is the biggest consequence, the biggest reprisal of doing bad things.
I would agree. And I would also say that it's the biggest consequence of not allowing or not having free speech. Because if someone isn't allowed to be challenged, if someone isn't allowed to see the opposing argument, then what they're saying will just get relegated to an echo chamber. That echo chamber is just going to go ahead and repeat what that person says,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of how vile or disgusting they are, and it's never going to get challenged. And instead of having somebody be able to be placed in a position to where they can evolve, they'll just slowly degenerate into, these online trolls. Will disintegrate into
Mm-hmm.
people who don't go outside, and they'll just kind of create, I guess, a lack of freedom for themselves, because
Mm-hmm.
they'll only exist within this small echo chamber versus existing in the world and having their ideas and their thoughts challenged.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah. So if I was to put into my own words what you're saying, and again, stop me if I get anything wrong or if I oversimplify anything, but the way I understand it is, without this free will, this free speech, to come across conflicting opinions, right? Opinions different from one's own, a person will sort of galvanize themselves. They'll sort of be worse off. They will not reach the full potential of their free speech, of their liberty to speak freely, because they will be stuck in this sort of loop where they only associate with people that say they're right, that reinforces that they're right, and then they will not be open to other opinions because, well, they have this whole group to tell them that opinion is wrong, and they won't think for themselves. So yeah, I guess that would also be included. So not only does, having bad intentions and saying and doing bad things hurt the person themselves on a moral standpoint, but from what I understand, it also hurts their freedom, because morality and freedom are two separate things. Although morality, in my opinion, should guide freedom. What you're saying is that a person who doesn't, um, a person who does not reach the full potential of their freedom, have this negative freedom to be free from things, from other opinions and things like that, they will only worse off. Hold on, I'm like blanking at words right now because I'm like processing this as I'm saying it. But yeah, they will not be able to reach the full potential of their liberty because they'll be stuck in this group that's constantly saying this is right, this is right, this is right. Ignore any opposing opinions.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Okay,
That's
very good.
actually that was a point of view that I developed recently, by going to the ABCs of book banning screening and seeing that, people were getting these books banned and removed from school curriculums without even actually reading the books.
Mm,
And I mean, to be so vehemently opposed to something without actually picking it up and reading it and formulating an opinion, versus, someone says, oh, this book was written by a drag queen. So because it's written by a drag queen, it can't be good for kids to read. They're trying to indoctrinate them. And it's like, if you haven't picked up the book and read it, you're limiting your ability to learn something. And just perception is everything.
mm-hmm.
You're limiting yourself, you're limiting your own freedom, and in turn you are literally limiting their freedom to write this material, to have this material available, by banning said books because of how you feel versus
Mm-hmm.
any knowledge actually obtained from it or against it. You don't have to agree with it even after checking it out and formulating an opinion, but at least you'd have an informed opinion at that moment.
Right. I mean, personally speaking, there's very few times I'll see an informative video, an informative book, and I 100% agree with everything.
Of
Um,
course.
so yeah, honestly, just having the potential to be able to read it, to be able to incorporate at least the author's opinions, the author's work into one's own, whether you agree with it or not. I think that is better for a person reaching the potential of their freedom. Now that actually brings up an interesting point I didn't even think about, that being separating the art from the artist, which I think, of course, relates to freedom. Art, of course, being a, how would I describe art in terms of freedom? Because I'm thinking about it right now as we're talking about. I would say art is a good barometer of a society's freedom. Depending on what art they have, how much art, what is possible within their art, I think I can use that to gauge the amount of freedom a society has as a whole. But how would you say art is as it relates to freedom?
For me, it's difficult to separate the art from the artist. And an example I'll give is actually a personal example. R. Kelly. R.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly was an artist and performer that, for me, I mean, that was like, he had this album called The Chocolate Factory. And like that album being released when it was like right in the middle of, my heyday in terms of pursuing women. So I'd use music from that and stuff like that and lines from that, and it all worked out well. Then to find out that the direction of said desires, at least from the artist, were being placed on women who were being, they were being exploited.
Mm-hmm.
And that exploitation between the art and the artist, like it became too much for me to be able to separate them. So, with that being said, I think that you should be free to create the art that you want as long as it's within legal boundaries, because that even starts to make me think, and I apologize if I'm rambling to the listeners out there,
No worries.
but
Oh.
it also makes me think of like the anime, and then the people who have like anime hentai, and then the hentai that they do is like lolly, which is like young looking women and like being in sexually suggestive situations. And it's like, I understand that there's an artist and there's someone putting that together, but that's just something that I wouldn't necessarily be able to consume. Although, and this is like one of the things where it's like, damn, do you say, hey, people have the freedom to consume said art? And for me, I would say that would be something that needs to be restricted. So it's hard for me to just confidently say that being able to separate the art from the artist, and the art actually having its own semblance of, free speech being attributed to it. I think that it's kind of it's me going to the extremes on both ends, so to speak. And the extreme of what the negative outcome can be, to me, I don't think would be necessarily worth the risk.
Mm-hmm. So the way I see it is, I see it in, and this is with a lot of things, I see it in terms of a spectrum. I think a lot of things are on a spectrum. So the way I see it is, the amount that a person can separate an art from an artist would be on this spectrum, because it really depends on how much the artist puts themselves into the art, right? Like, if, okay, for example, if we take an artist like Banksy, fairly anonymous, no one knows who Banksy is. You could say this work is a Banksy, but who really knows? Banksy is entirely anonymous. We can't say with any much certainty who Banksy is, why they do what they do, and what that implies to the art. So, a person can look at a Banksy and be like, well, Banksy intended this, or they intended that, or, this and that. But because the amount of anonymity Banksy has, I would say that you can kind of separate Banksy from the art, because no one really knows who they are. Whereas in some works, the artist is very pivotal to the work itself, right? So if you look at, like, I don't know, a self-portrait, right? It's almost entirely impossible to remove the artist from that piece of art, because it's a self-portrait. It's literally the exact subject of the art, right? You could, say, oh, it's honestly, it isn't even up for debate. The intention of the art is the artist themselves. So in that way, it's in the spectrum that it is almost impossible. You would have to be a monk of considerable enlightenment to be able to look at a self-portrait and say, I've entirely removed the artist from this self-portrait. Because that's, now, again, those are the two extremes. One where it's very easy to remove the art from the artist because the artist is entirely anonymous, right? You couldn't even find them if you tried. You can't even say that person made that art because you could be wrong, right? Like, if the artist is entirely anonymous, right? Okay, say we take something outside of Banksy. Say someone draws something, puts it online, and that person is completely anonymous, and then they make another account and draw some other thing, right? You can't tie the artist to that art because it's just anonymous art. It's just out there in the world, like, kind of like a phenomenon, like the Grand Canyon. It's just out there now. You can't attribute it to that artist. So in that way, you can entirely separate the artist from that art because it could be anybody, right? Especially now with how much power people have in terms of anonymity. And in other cases, it's impossible to remove the artist from the art because that is the whole point of it. And a lot of art is in the middle. A lot of art is in the middle. Like, for example, like a novel, right? Like if someone was to write a fictional novel, you could say, oh, I've separated the author from this book, like from this novel. But a lot of the things in the novel probably come from inspiration from that person's life, what they've experienced, the things they chose to include in that book, the things they chose not to include in that book, right? It is very much tied to that artist, but it can also kind of be separated because it's its own work and it's your interpretation of that work. So because art is in the spectrum of how much of the artist's influence is in it, I think it is possible to remove the art from the artist, and sometimes it's impossible. But like 99% of the art is somewhere in that middle, where where the artist is kind of ingrained, but also parts of it can be removed, if that makes sense.
That actually makes perfect sense, and it gave me a point of view that I kind of did not consider. And when you said Banksy, like right when you said it, I was like, that is so true, because that is somebody who is completely separated from the actual art itself,
Mm-hmm.
and in a sense that kind of creates the art,
Yeah.
one and the same.
Honestly, I would love to have a podcast on art. I'm just going to make a little note on that so I can start taking notes for next time. But yes, keep going.
And I'd be up to do that because I mean the many different forms that it actually comes in, and like you mentioned, how much of the actual artist is going to be in said artwork. Yeah, especially when you have artists who basically are anonymous and
Mm-hmm.
they don't necessarily want the recognition, or they don't even want anyone to potentially see themselves in said artwork. So yeah, that would be a really good conversation.
Honestly, that happens all the time. You would mention something, and I'm like, I didn't even think of that. I'm going to think about this from now on because there's so much to dissect about it. So, yeah, these kind of epiphanies, I would say, are fairly mutual because, it, like we said before, having this kind of back and forth, this sort of different opinion, bouncing it off somebody, especially when we disagree. I feel like when we disagree, we come to learn a lot more than when we just agree.
Agreed.
Yes, ironically enough. So yeah, when it comes to freedom and art, it applies kind of the same thing with free speech. But they're not, I wouldn't say they're entirely the same. I wouldn't say all the rules that apply to free speech also apply to art. Because art, I would say, takes a lot more forms than free speech. Like, back to Banksy. Some of Banksy's art, I would say, is partly a performance art. Because, you do have the actual, like, physical painting, but you also have these performances that sometimes would happen. Like, I think a very infamous one was the one where immediately after a portrait was sold at an auction, it was shredded, once it was sold. And after it was shredded, it was actually worth a lot more than it was pre-shredded. But the shredding itself, in my opinion, is a performance art. It's about the performance of that happening. You could be the person with the shredded up art. You could have been in that room when the art was shredded. It's all about being in the present of the performance. And performance art is something I am very much familiar with, being a virtual streamer, and that's pretty much all I do. I do some like pre-recorded stuff, like skits and stuff like that. But for the most part, I would consider myself a performance artist. It's about being here in the moment when I'm performing, right? Like, for example, the podcast on identity, even though it was, unfortunately couldn't be salvaged, imagine being there when we were doing that podcast in that moment when I was performing. Yeah, we were podcasting, but it was also partly a performance of mine, like all these other live streams I do are. So art and free speech, I don't think the same rules apply between freedom to art and freedom of speech, because the inclusion of performance art opens up us to a lot more possibilities, because it's performance art. It's not like a traditional art like a painting or something like that. Like performance art can include things like hurting yourself or hurting other people. And in that sense, there should be rules. There should be moral rules to performance art. One, of course, being consent, right? If you're going to do a performance art, make sure you and the people in it are consenting.
Agreed. It's kind of like when you go to a theme park and they have a wet zone. It's like you are, if you sit in the wet zone, you're agreeing to the potential or the likelihood that you're gonna get wet. And I think that
Exactly.
that definitely needs to be a part of it. And in terms of like conceptualized art and the ability to kind of have it be performative in that moment, I agree. And it's a main reason why I do want to transition to like having at least more of a live type of show presence to where
Mhm.
I can interact with people that are watching, because I love the idea and the concept that it existed at this moment in time only once, and then
Exactly.
not actually record said episode and have something that people can go back to,
Hmm.
because it's something that happened once. And
Exactly.
if you were there, you got to experience it. And if you weren't there, then you did not get to experience it.
Hmm.
And that's something that I've been like kind of mulling around myself and trying to figure out how I can get organized enough to do that. But
Oh yeah, definitely.
100% agree in that regard. 100% agree.
Yeah, like I could see some of my friends are here for the chat. Some of them are lurking. That's perfectly fine. But I would be, I would be pickled as a peach if I could get like a lot more people. Okay, this isn't me saying, oh, I want to get popular. I want to make money on streaming. No, I would love it if people would like ask us questions like in chat while we're doing this, and we can bring it up and get more people, more minds on this. Because having just the two of us is great. I think this whole system is very, very well structured, and it's very good for like contemplating and bouncing ideas off each other. But getting people to ask questions, getting people to be involved, getting people to be like, oh, I didn't think of that, have you thought of that? That would make me pickle as a peach. So hopefully next time we can get a couple more chatters, and we can by then maybe I make it big. No, but like it's not about the popularity for me, it's about the performance. And for this performance, for this podcast, it would be so much better with a lot more people.
Agreed. It's and I can see where you're coming from in terms of it not being the popularity that's what's important.
Hmm.
What's important is the experience in itself that can be had from different minds clashing, or agreeing or disagreeing and questioning and looking for further clarification on something, or something that we bring up, if they understand it a little bit more deeply and they
Oh
can give
yeah.
us more reference for it. And those are the things that I find so exciting about the idea of even, approaching live streaming. It's the ability to, and it's different than what you'll see from, the live streamers who are the popular ones of today, where they're doing
Compare from
things
here.
just to get reactions and stuff.
Right.
I love the idea of just the feedback, because that's the entire reason why I even wanted to have the podcast. It was to discuss these topics that I'm having internal dialogue about
Hmm.
with other people.
Right.
You know, it's and there's something so human about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
It's definitely part of the human experience, especially now that we have the liberty to do so with technology. Because I imagine the two of us were on different parts of the world. This is a conversation that probably would never have existed the way it is without technology, without the convenience that things like the internet, live streaming, computer systems can afford us. Um,
agreed.
yeah,
And I think about that whenever we talk, because
of
of
course,
your character being virtual. I'm like,
exactly,
the fact that I am having this conversation with a virtual representation, with an artistic expression of the artist, like the living embodiment of the expression, like an actual conversation with. And
exactly,
yeah, it really it gets me excited when we have these conversations, because that's
definitely,
another thing that I think about. Like,
it
this is
is.
kind of cool.
There are very few times in a person's life they could say they had a conversation like this with a virtual streamer. This is one of them.
Agreed, agreed. And I count myself lucky for it, because therein lies like a lot of what we were discussing in terms of freedom. There is the freedom to create a character, to create an expressive part or portion of yourself, and share that with the world, and let that, being that's been created explore the ideas and ideals of other people, and being able to have like a calm, rational, reasonable conversation.
Right.
And those are the things that I think that we lack, because there is a lot of just, you're on the other team, then we're in opposition and I hate you.
Yeah.
And this kind of breaks that down, like it breaks it down tremendously. And I think it's a good means of, I was talking to my wife about this. I said this would be a great way, for trials to take place, so that
Hmm.
you don't see what the person looks like. You don't see their race. You don't see how big they are, but you actually just listen to the facts, and then you give, a verdict based on the facts presented.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Honestly, that man, I would love to have a podcast on justice. Let me just make a note of this,
oh yeah,
on justice,
definitely.
because I had, well, yeah, I had pretty much the same idea. Like I would mull it over, and I would be like, well, honestly, I would say what birthed the idea was I read somewhere that apparently parole, the chance of getting parole is partly dependent on how long it's been since the judge has had a meal, right? Like right, like if they haven't had food for a while, lower chance for parole. Like, well, this is justice. This is someone's time. This is time that they could be using somewhere else with their life. Their precious time. They only have the time in their life. They don't have anything more. That's the most precious resource. So this is someone's time, whether or not they get parole. This is someone's precious time, and basing it off whether or not you had a sandwich or you liked your sandwich or you had cereal seems like an extreme spit in the face of what should be justice. We should be striving to eliminate that. And then, of course, I thought about it, and I thought about it like, well, I guess there's other things that affect like how justice is served, at least in this country. Things like, how you appear in court, whether or not you have a suit, right? Like how you talk. And I'm like, all this shouldn't matter. Like it really shouldn't. But like, that isn't what happens realistically, right? Like, your lawyer will say, come in with a suit. If you don't have a suit, I'll give you a suit. Why do they do that? Because they want to win. Why do they want to win? Because that's the goal, right? So really, all these things that shouldn't matter. So I thought, okay, well, what if justice was served without like looking at the person, without having these biases on the person? Because like, what's the point of all this like fluff? It just burrs more bias. Because the judges are human, right? I can't blame them for not being human. But at the same time, if you make a scenario where people are more likely to be biased, they're going to be biased.
Of course. It's funny when you have things in court that take place where they'll say something knowing that it's going to have to get tossed out because it wasn't presented in discovery or early enough within the case, but they wanted to say it just to implant the thought into the jury or the judge's mind. And that trickery, it's like, this is someone's time, as you mentioned. This is not what justice is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Justice is supposed to be blind.
Right.
So, I mean, if it's blind, it would suggest that it would be unable to see the accused or the accuser.
Right.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think that that plays into freedom. And I do think that technology is going to be able to kind of course correct for that
Mm-hmm.
over time.
Yeah.
Especially like the developments that have happened, with online video chatting and discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so I am fairly certain that technology will, as you said, course correct for justice. And just to make sure that we're still on the topic of freedom, I would still consider this partly to do with freedom because justice, crime, and punishment. This is essentially we punish people by punishing their freedom, right? Like,
Agreed.
yeah, like if someone is punished by the justice system, what we do is we take away their freedom. The harder we punish them, the more freedom we take away. So talking about justice is congruent to freedom. So I would say we're still on topic on this, in terms of our podcast on freedom. But yeah, so hold on. Could you remind me the last thing you said? I feel like I went off topic trying to relate the two.
Oh no, no problem. It was in regards to technology being able to basically correct some of the issues and the wrongs
Hmm.
with the lack of justice. Like you mentioned before, how if someone didn't have enough protein or enough carbohydrates or enough water in their diet, that's going to affect the decision that they make on someone's life, and that's affecting someone's time, and in
Hmm.
effect, that's affecting someone's freedom directly.
Right.
And the more harsher the punishment, the more freedom that is removed and restricted. You know, even if you go to jail, if you get in trouble, excuse me, you go to prison, if you get
Hmm.
in trouble in prison, they put you in solitary confinement,
Right.
which is again removing more and more of your freedom.
Exactly. Actually, I find it interesting because if we look at this in terms of positive and negative freedom, they take away both, obviously, right? Like, when a person is imprisoned, they have they have much less positive freedom, right? They can't go out and buy the latest PlayStation, right? Well, actually, very few people can because PlayStations are very much, out of stock. But they can't like go out and have all of the positive freedoms that they're allowed to. But of course, their negative freedoms are also taken away. But we got to be careful here how much negative freedom can be taken away. I think the negative freedom is taken away mainly out of convenience. But we got to be careful here. Like, we don't want to get to the point where, you take away someone's freedom of speech. That seems like fairly unnecessary. I can't think of any scenario where that would be appropriate.
I mean, I really can't think of a situation either.
Yeah, like
You know,
that
as
seems
long as you're
cruel,
not
unusual.
screaming, there's a fire in a crowded building. As long
Right.
as you're not doing that, I mean, regardless of how much someone wants to or does not want to hear it, it's their right to say it, you know?
Exactly. So, in terms of how justice connects to positive and negative freedom, generally, it seems like both are taken away. I think idealistically, it should just be the. Hold on. I'm thinking about this in my mind as I'm saying it, so I want to make sure that I actually agree with what I'm saying. Let me think. I want to say that idealistically, just the positive freedom should be taken away. Should negative freedoms be taken away for a person who is, goes through the justice system and, they have been convicted of doing something that they shouldn't have, something immoral? Should their negative freedoms be taken away? So that would be things like freedom of speech, freedom to create art, freedom from things. I want to make sure I agree with this before I fully commit to this, but I think that's about right. I think idealistically, not realistically, but idealistically, just their positive freedom should be taken away. Their freedom to do things, not their freedom from things, right?
I mean, like as you're saying it, I'm kind of going through my head, and I guess
Yeah.
it really depends on what the ultimate intended outcome is.
Right.
Because if the intended outcome is for rehabilitation,
Right.
then I would say you would only want to limit their positive freedoms. However, if rehabilitation is not the goal,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't seem to be the case, with our current situation and setup,
Right.
then I mean, that's when you start taking away their negative freedoms. And that is what occurs, like now that I think about it, because if you go to jail or prison rather, they're you're told when to go to sleep. You're
Right.
told when the lights go out. You're told what you can and can't. You are told what you can and cannot say.
Right.
And wow, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to mull that over myself before I fully commit to one way or the other because I never thought of it that way. But yeah, well, actually, if we're going on the route of rehabilitation, right? If you have, okay, not even the justice system, but if you have someone who's like addicted to something, right? You would have to take away some of their negative freedoms, right? Like they shouldn't be allowed to be near this enabling object, whatever it is they're addicted to, whether it's gambling, whether it's drinking, whatever it is. They shouldn't be allowed to because they're going to hurt themselves with it. Actually, that brings up an interesting one. I don't want to say last, but this was the last thing I wrote down, and this is the idea of capacity. Some people might call this agency, but I prefer to use the term capacity because I'm much more familiar with that. But in terms of how agency or capacity relates to freedom, right? So if a person has agency, if they have capacity, personally, me, I prefer to use the term capacity. They can be used interchangeably here, but I'm just going to say capacity. So if a person has decisional capacity, that means that they are of sound mind and they can make decisions. They can tell you the difference between good and evil, and they can make the best decision for themselves, right? If a person, for whatever reason, is lacking decisional capacity, idealistically, they should have their freedom taken away based on how little capacity they have left, right? So if a person is bleeding out, right, they can't think straight, right? They're right, like their actions don't make sense. they should be restrained and put in a scenario where they can heal until they're better and they can make decisions for themselves. That's the way I see it. But this is a spectrum, right? Like a person can start losing decisional capacity for all number of things, right? It could be head trauma. It could be because of some sort of, I guess, psychological or mental issue that progressively gets worse. It could just be getting drunk, right? The more drunk a person gets, the less decisional capacity they'll have. So what you do, you take away their keys. You don't let them drive. So that's how I see capacity and freedom. The less decisional capacity a person has, the less freedom they should be allowed to have. That's how I see it.
I'll have to mull that over because on the surface, I 100% agree.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, because you had mentioned it's on a spectrum, if let's say the reason that that person is bleeding out is because they decided that they no longer wanted to
Mm.
participate in this realm of existence, should they then be forced to participate in this realm of existence?
I see your
You know,
point.
versus allowing them to check out. So it is something I'll have to actually mull over a little bit. But on the surface, I mean, I of course 100% agree. I do believe that, if someone is incapable of being able to make a sound decision, then said sound decision should be removed. But I could see how that could be multiplied by someone who considers themselves to be more intelligent or more capable and saying, well, then the masses need to be controlled and should not have this autonomy and they need to be steered or guided towards this direction.
Right.
So, yeah, on the surface, I can agree. Like
Right.
when you get into the abstract, corners of it, then that's where I would probably run into a little bit of a struggle in agreeing with it.
Yeah. So I have mulled over a lot of these sort of snags as I was thinking about it. Because these are things that I've like been thinking about for a little while now. But okay, so the first thing you brought up is something I'm very familiar with, and that is, should a person partake in a activity that causes them to lose decisional capacity? How do we interact with that? So let's start with an easy one, right? Like a person getting drunk. I love using this example because it is a really good way to sort of gauge, because the more a person drinks, generally the less decisional capacity they're going to have, and the amount they drink is really up to the person, right? Unless of course someone's forcing them to drink, or it could be like a societal thing, like a party, right? You might be like influenced to drink more at parties and things like that. But at the end of the day, as long as no one's forcing the bottle down their throat, a person is choosing how much they drink, right? So the way I see it is, if a person knows that when they get drunk, they act like this, right? Because, people tend to have some idea as to how they are drunk, right? Like, oh, I'm kind of an angry drunk, I'm kind of like a silly drunk, or I'm just like, a whole mess when I'm drunk or whatever. If a person has fairly good idea as to, what's going to happen when they get drunk, how drunk they are, and when they are of sound mind and body decide, I'm going to keep drinking past that point, I would say that the fault would be on that person, because they have fairly good idea of what's going to happen, and then what happens happens. It's like, you fill your house with dynamite. What happens is when the house explodes? Well, you shouldn't have filled it with dynamite. But if a person doesn't know, right, like, this would be like, if a person gets into like a car crash, there's no way they would predict that, right? They get a head trauma and suddenly, they're forced onto a stretcher, put into the hospital, and, someone's like sticking tubes in them, sticking a thing down their throat to make sure they could breathe, what have you, to save their life. So the way I see it is, the fault lies when the person is still of sound mind and body, right? Everything that happens after that really depends on what the person can, I don't want to sound like a consequentialist, but what the person can logically assume will happen, right? Like, people don't drive their cars with a good chance that they're going to get into a car crash. They very much hope that that doesn't happen. But when a person's sitting down drinking, if no one's like, forcing the drink down their throat, right? If they know what they're going to be like, if they know what's going to happen, they should be in control of that. And if they get to the point where they lose decisional capacity, they should make plans to be like, okay, you're that, like, that's the point of a designated driver. Like, they would assign, okay, you're the designated driver because I know I'm going to drink past the point where I can have any kind of decisional capacity. So I'm making plans now for you to have decisional capacity when I'm at that point.
And I think that ties into the personal responsibility of freedom
Mm-hmm.
because even if you've never drank before, barring, you coming from like an Amish community or you're
Right.
somehow growing up in the allegory of the cave, you understand that alcohol is an inhibitor and
Mhm.
it's going to have an effect on you, whether it be a positive or negative effect. And if someone does not plan accordingly, like they go to a bar, they don't arrange for a designated driver, or they go to a house party and they just all of a sudden take two shots and they've never drank before, I think that before you take the two shots, regardless of peer pressure, regardless of, situations and situational awareness, I think that the responsibility for what occurs after that is going to be placed on that person. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of young women are kind of struggling with that. And I don't want to use consequence because I don't think it's a consequence, but going out drinking and being placed in a situation to where they don't have all their faculties, so they may be a little bit more suggestible to things they would not be suggestible to had they not, had the copious amounts of alcohol. So
Mhm.
I do agree, and I somewhat disagree, but I think it does boil down to personal responsibility, in my opinion.
Right. Like, for example, babies have essentially no decisional capacity. Everything that they're free to do has to be controlled by their caretaker, whether it's their parents or their guardian or whatever, right? The babies have essentially no freedom, right? They have limited positive freedoms, and their negative freedoms, they obviously don't have a lot of faculties to actually express negative freedoms at all. But their freedoms should be limited by the person with capacity, their guardian, their caretaker, or whatever, until, the baby eventually grows up and they get decisional capacity. In this country, it's like I think at like 17 or 18, depending on what state, that a child will be able to make decisions for themselves and things like that. So yeah, that's also where decisional capacity is on someone else, because the baby has potential to get decisional capacity eventually.
Agreed. And it's funny because it'll be 17 to 18, but a brain isn't fully developed, at least for men, actually men and women, until around the age of 25.
Yeah.
So, and it's like, if you're using drugs or if you're drugs, alcohol, or even over the counter stuff, that could affect said development, in
Right.
which case could affect said decision making.
Right.
But ultimately, I do think that there is a bit of a, not a moral compass, but there is a societal compass that we do understand. And we do need to take personal responsibility for the reactions to the actions that we do take. And also, that's just about self preservation and being able to pass your genes along genetically in the future. Because if you don't take that responsibility for yourself, you're going to put yourself, your loved ones in situations that could cause them potential harm.
Mm-hmm.
And, the more it's like if you go out drinking on a day that it's raining cats and dogs, you know, you're going to increase the odds of an accident. And that's even, if it's not on you. Someone could just not be paying attention, hydroplane, and slam into you.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an additional risk that you're taking on by saying, hey, this is what I want to go out and do. There is the possibility for a negative outcome.
Right. And to sort of add on to that, also, people who might be on the spectrum. Like, I have a sibling who has ADHD, and I would say, I've lived with him my whole life. I would say that he's not at the point where he can have decisional capacity yet. He's dealt with it very, very well, but I wouldn't say he's old enough to have decisional capacity. There's still some things he just doesn't get yet. There's still some things he can't make decisions on yet because, you know, he doesn't think them all the way through as yet. I think eventually, he'll be able to have decisional capacity, but because of how this country works, you get capacity when you reach that age, whatever it is on your state, and then you're an adult, and now you have to take responsibility for everything and all your actions and stuff like that, at least in terms of the law. Now again, this flies in the face of convenience because this would be very inconvenient, but idealistically, a person should have capacity when their brain reaches that mature age. And, it's usually at around like 25, like you said. But for people who might be on the spectrum, they might not get that until a later age down the line. It might take their brains a little longer to develop. and other factors can come into play, like kind of like I just said, like drinking, taking certain recreational drugs. These can delay a person getting to the point in their life where they can have full decisional capacity. But the way I see it is, now this is to tackle the second sort of nuance. People who think that they're smarter than everybody and therefore they should be able to decide the fate of other people and things like that. I don't see agency or capacity as the same as intelligence. I think once a person reaches capacity, they have reached it. Capacity isn't like an infinite goal to reach like intelligence. Like intelligence is an infinite goal, right? You never reach a peak intelligence and you are now the smartest ever. No, intelligence you could just keep getting smarter and smarter and smarter. It's an infinite goal. I think capacity is not an infinite goal. I think once you reach decisional capacity, you've reached it. Right? Doesn't matter how smart you are, you just have decisional capacity now. You now have the ability to make your own decisions and deal with the consequences of those said decisions because you have decisional capacity. You're not a baby, right? You have decisional capacity. You're an adult. Doesn't matter how smart you are. You could be like super smart. I think there is some level of intelligence. Like if you have absolutely no intelligence, I would say you cannot reach decisional capacity. Like, I don't know, if you have severe brain trauma, right? You just can't reach decisional capacity. There is some level of intelligence, but I don't think being more intelligent means you have more capacity than other people that also might, be of around your same age, same decisional capacity. So yeah, decisional capacity, it's a goal that a person will reach in their life, barring any sort of extraneous thing like, brain trauma, being on the spectrum, taking recreational drugs and things like that. So if a person is like, oh, I'm so smart, so I can decide things for you, even though we both have decisional capacity, no, I don't think that's true. If both parties have decisional capacity, they can both decide for themselves.
Agreed. Because intelligence, on the same note, it's relative.
It is.
I mean, if let's say you have someone who's a medical doctor and someone who's, advanced at primitive skills.
Mm-hmm.
If, they're in a situation to where they need to survive in the wilderness, yes, the medical doctor is considered to be traditionally more intelligent than the person with primitive skills. However, the person with primitive skills has a higher likelihood of success because the area in which they evolve their intelligence is applicable to said situation. So, and I agree that capacity is kind of like a baseline you reach to make decisions governing yourself, and that intelligence is something that you kind of gain through outside influence and time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this did show up while I was researching positive and negative freedom, where one of the fallacies was that people with higher intelligence would make decisions for other people who are not as intelligent based solely on the concept of intelligence. And I thought, wait a minute, what about agency? What about capacity, like decisional capacity, right? Like if people are adults, if people can make decisions, they have decisional capacity. But again, idealistically, people should be adults when they've reached decisional capacity, but that's hard to measure. That's hard to really gauge, right? Like you can ask them questions, like, you would have to ask them questions. You would have to be like, okay, can you tell right from wrong? Do you know what's going to happen when this happens? This is something that like, requires a lot of work. This requires a lot of people to like go, like, imagine before you had to become an adult, before you get your license and before you could, right, like vote and stuff. You would have to like go to a doctor and then they would have to gauge to see if you have decisional capacity, and then you would like have to go through a whole process and then like, okay, here's your adult card now, you have decisional capacity, right?
I think we'd be in a much smoother, cleaner ran world, to be honest with you.
We would, we would, but that would take so much man hours instead of just, okay, you're 18, go to the DMV, get your driver's license, read this book and pass, a basic test on driving. But we would be better off for it because, people would have the proof, right? Like by the government that they have decisional capacity, that they're actually adults and they're not just old children, I guess.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it would actually place the government in a situation to where there may be certain knowledge or information that people do not have access to that they would then be given access to because, they would want more people to have the ability to vote, or at least I would hope so,
Mm-hmm.
and more people to have the ability to perform, basically, hey, you want to go work, you want to go get a job, well, you have to be able to meet these bare minimum qualifications
Right.
because that means that you're more likely to not spit in someone's food because you understand that
The consequence.
exactly.
Yeah, you're not a kid anymore. Um, but just to sort of fancy this idea a bit more, because it is a good idea, but I don't think we're at the level of technological convenience where this would be very practical as yet. Um, because one other caveat is, as people get older, they tend to lose decisional capacity, right? Not that it happens like over time. It can happen gradually, but it could also happen all at once, right? You could suddenly be like, in your 70s and be, fully aware, have all your decisional capabilities and stuff like that. And then you're in your 80s and suddenly, you start getting forgetful. You start like not being able to fully take care of yourself, make decisions on your own. In which case, like, how do you do that on like a bureaucratic scale, right? Like bureaucracy is a very powerful thing, but it's also very, very annoying because, like what would you have to do? Test people like, once they reach a certain age, it's like, oh, you're like in your 60s, you're like in your 70s. Do you want to do another like, capacity test to see if you can still make decisions for yourself? Right? Because,
Well, we
yeah,
do that to people, like in terms of, removing that positive freedom of driving.
right.
They do take said tests, and if they don't pass that test, they end up losing their rights. And if someone is active enough, like within the family, or like someone who's looking to get, the right guardianship or something over an older person, those are things, there are tests and things in place that people do in order to prove their ability to, or not be able to perform tasks based on what they figure is some kind of like baseline. So like
Mm-hmm.
it does kind of exist now, but
Mm-hmm.
it's typically wielded, negatively, at least from my experiences and what I've seen and read about it.
Right. Yeah, yeah. You're right. You're right on that one. That's true. Um, but yeah, so just to recap, because I do, right, like, I guess that does kind of open my eye. Yeah, we do have systems in place to start to remove people's freedom when they've reached a certain level of lacking decisional capacity as to not hurt themselves or others. That is true. But, it's probably not as robust as it could be, as, seamless as it can be. But that's, that all comes with time. That all comes with convenience, technological improvements, you know, more man hours because technology gets better, things like that. Um, but yeah, so that would be the relationship between freedom and capacity, decisional capacity.
Agreed. And it's funny how it kind of goes back to where we started with the negative versus positive freedoms, and
Mm-hmm.
how, when we look at it in terms of capacity, there is, again, not a restriction on your negative freedoms. It's more along the lines of the positive freedoms, in regards to, oh, well, your eyesight isn't as good as it used to be. We'll have to remove your freedom to drive,
Right.
or, you're not able to cook with gas anymore because you leave it on, or like
Mm-hmm.
you leave something on there that's not supposed to go there. So that'll be another freedom that is removed. And I think that, when you look at it that way, the removal of said freedoms being on the positive aspect of it versus the negative aspect, which are kind of like more inalienable,
Exactly.
I do think that I do think that there needs to be more time, energy, and effort placed into that, especially for like the disenfranchised of our society, like soldiers who come back, with battle
Mm-hmm.
fatigue, or PTSD is what it's referred to as now, and being able to actually provide them help, and even also, when it comes to purchasing a firearm, which I think,
Right.
you know is a right that we have. It's the Second Amendment. However, I don't think that just because you're 18 that you should be able to purchase a firearm, because you do have some people who are not at capacity. They're not
Exactly.
capable of the responsibility that comes with that because they're still children in their mind.
Exactly. Right. So, yeah, that, as I said before, that was the last thing on my notes in terms of freedom. We went through the whole thing, and I had a lot of notes here. Um, was there any more things you wanted to talk about in terms of freedom?
In terms of what we discussed, one thing I would actually ideally like to do. I think we've kind of gone over everything within this conversation, but eventually I'd love to get to a point to where we kind of combine the topics of everything we've discussed,
Oh yeah.
because it all just really ties in. And if it's a day that we plan for like this will be a 6 hour episode because we're really gonna dig.
Hmm.
And those are things that I would like to explore in the future. But as of now, I think we've thoroughly covered the topics, or at least as deeply as we can get into them now
Hmm.
without going on for an additional 2 hours.
Yes, like if I had more time, if I had more notes, I would have loved to get into it because this is a very multifaceted topic. There's a lot to talk about here. I can relate this to masculinity. We related this to identity when we talked about the empirically powerful and the abstract and their relationship to identity and freedom. But yeah, we talked briefly about masculinity on it. Um, in terms of power, I feel like there were aspects of power sort of sprinkled throughout, but honestly, if I had the time, if I had the notes, I could have probably made a specific example relating freedom to power. That definitely seems like a really good idea. Like next time we do podcasts, just have parts of the podcast that relate to previous parts. So that way it all kind of interconnects. It would make for, well, one, really good live content, really good overall content to be able to, have all these kind of interconnect in some way.
Yeah, kind of like it's the funny thing, the first thing that popped in my head was the old Marvel trading cards and how they were individual cards. However, there were certain cards that would make up an overarching image when you combine those, 9 cards together.
I am familiar with those
And
cards, yeah.
okay, perfect. And like to me, I think that that's kind of where our conversations go because all these things do tie into each other, much like a rope does.
Hmm.
And I do agree that if even if myself I had taken the time and like made the connections to the previous episodes, it would have been a lot more readily available in terms of like the relation to the previous episode and the harkening back and all those things. And one thing I'd like to throw out there to anyone that's listening, whether you're listening live or you listen to this on the recording on my end, if you have any questions or if you have any thoughts or if you have any like insight that you want to bounce off of us, because we will have another episode together, please make yourself known, even if you need to create a throwaway account, even if you want to throw something out there that's just hate, or for want of a better term, it's just like a negative comment. Throw it out there because that's something that the two of us can actually openly discuss.
Definitely.
And it's open. It's 100% open, regardless of how bad or good it is. It's something we'd love that engagement. And I'm speaking for you. I apologize, but I'm sure
I
you'd
agree.
agree.
Yeah, definitely. I'm like now I'm deciding whether it would be more appropriate to do the next one on the subject of art or justice because there's a lot I got to say about both, but also there's some level of appropriateness. Like some would kind of relate better to freedom. I feel like maybe art because that relates to freedom, but also justice also relates to freedom, but in like a different sense, in a different way it relates to freedom. So I'm not sure which would be more appropriate for the next one. But I'm gonna sit on it. I'm gonna take down notes, and whatever I have the most notes for, we're gonna set up another podcast and just like have a little powwow, have a little back and forth again.
Let's do it because I'm telling you, I really enjoy these because this is exactly what I was looking to do. I was looking for somebody who I could bounce off of, agree with, disagree with, and still have a civil discourse about said subject matter. And for me, I mean, whether we do, art or we go to justice, I think those are two topics we'll cover. It's just be a matter of which one we cover first. So
Oh yeah, exactly. So, I guess that would be it for our little powwow on freedom. It was very insightful. Again, I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't learn. I was learning as we were talking, so that's always very good. Um, I'm probably going to study a bit on the podcast we did previously just to, have a bit more. Now that I'm conscious of this whole uh, concept of relating the podcast to each other, because it was just something that just kind of popped in here and there, like, oh, this kind of reminds me of identity, this kind of reminds me of masculinity. But now that I'm conscious of relating it, we'll probably have a lot more interconnectivity for the next one.
agreed. And that's something I'll do on myself. I do like actually going back and listening to the episodes that we do because of things that I catch that I said or did, or you said or did, or
Hmm.
even just topics like, oh, I wish I had brought this up. And I think it'll add to the next time we have a conversation when we do harken back to previous episodes.
Yes. Okay. Very nice. Very nice. Very much like that. But I guess that will be it. Thank you for having me, Larry. This was a very insightful conversation.
No problem at all, Joey. As I mentioned before, I always love having you as a guest. And to everyone out there, who took the time to watch this episode, whether you watched it in clips or you watched it in one sitting, or you just happen to skip towards the end, we really appreciate the fact that you took the time to listen to the topic. And we really, really would appreciate some feedback because
Ditto.
we want to know if what we're doing is good. We want to know if it's right. We want to know if it's wrong. We want to know if you agree or disagree. We
Mhm.
would love to have a civil discourse about it.
Okay. Well, good night then. Take care.
All right.
Bye
Have
bye.
a good night, Joey. Bye
You
bye.
too. And I am.